Welcome to Back to the Father, a show about the journey of life focused on our final end, which is God Himself, our loving Father. And now, here's your host, Dave Palmer.
And welcome, everybody, to this Friday edition of Back to the Father. We were off last week, but we are live here today. We have a very interesting and a bit unusual show to share with you because we don't really have a specific format, okay? We're going to talk about, generally speaking, why do we study St. Thomas Aquinas? What is so special about Thomistic philosophy? And we have been very blessed this week to have Adrian Fonseca from our Houston office, host of Catholic Drive Time, to be here in the Dallas office because they're doing a lot of renovations down at the KSHJ studio in Houston. So he's been doing his show from here. And Sissel is out. She's out on retreat. And so we asked Adrian if he would come and be on the show with us. And even though he's done with his official duties for this week, he obliged and said he's here, and he's a big-time Thomist. He loves Aquinas like I do, and so he is over there. Hi, Adrian. How are you?
Howdy. Praise be to God. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and so we also have William Kirkendall, who's our wonderful high school senior homeschool intern, and has been doing this for over a year now, coming here, right?
Yeah,
Probably
last June.
Yeah, last June. So thanks for being here as well.
Of course.
And all right, and we also welcome, I guess, members of the CDT team, the real faithful Catholic Drive Time viewers and listeners. I think Adrian just sent out a text to you, so we hope you'll participate and let us know what's on your mind as well. So,
yes, Annabelle just joined us. Good morning to you, Annabelle. Lori on Facebook, good morning to you. And if you'd like to comment, then any questions, comments, or concerns, soapboxes, negativities, positivities, or anything in between, leave them in the chat below, and we'd love to get to them.
Can I brag a little bit about Annabelle?
Of course.
Okay, so I've been doing over the last 24 weeks this once a week kind of like lesson on the Summa. So in 24 weeks, we went through the whole thing. I would send out like a 35-minute video, and then there would be a live, Zoom meeting on Tuesday nights, and then there'd be a quiz that they could take as well. Well, Annabelle and her husband, Jim, went all the way through the whole thing.
Whoa.
Okay, so she studied the entire Summa with me and her husband, Jim.
Wow.
How long did it take?
And 24 weeks.
24 weeks.
Yeah,
Hey, you did the
24
whole
weeks.
Summa in 24 weeks?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, of course, not every article, but yeah. So we did the whole thing, just kind of like what I do when I teach the high school students, but I just did it for adults, in the evenings.
Impressive.
Well, then I would put a quiz on, and almost everybody who takes this quiz, like the first time they'll get a 60, and then they'll get maybe a 75 because they can redo it, and then they'll get an 80, and eventually, you just keep redoing it until you get 100. Annabelle had this interesting knack where almost every single time, the first time she took the quiz, she got 100 or maybe a 95 at the lowest. And so I think Annabelle has a real good sense of grasping Thomistic philosophy. So
that means we have to be very careful about what we say.
about her, yes.
No, I meant about Thomistic philosophy. She's going to catch us.
Yeah. So
She said, I'm an expert now.
Yeah, okay. I guess she kind of, to some degree, is. So I've got an article called "Why Do We Study St. Thomas Aquinas?" I was going to read some of the excerpts from that, but any, just kind of general comments from either of you before we get going?
No, not really. I think Thomistic philosophy is very important, and it's a field of study that has been lost in recent times, but it's making a revitalization in the recent time period. And I don't know if you caught this, I'm sure you talked about this, that they're celebrating St. Thomas Aquinas, Vatican is, and you can receive indulgence by celebrating. I forget what the rules are. I think it's like go to a Dominican priory or something like that.
Which there's one about 2 miles from here.
We can walk there.
Yeah. During the show.
Yeah, pilgrimage.
Yeah.
We'll live stream from a phone.
St. Albert the Great Dominican Priory.
There you go.
It's on the campus of UD.
There you go.
Which is, did you know UD was real close to here?
I could see the tower from the window.
Yeah.
Someone was pointing it out to me. I think Sissel was telling me. She said she tells her brother, climb up the tower and wave at me at work so I know you're still alive.
Good advice, yeah. So anyways, William's been doing this for, like we said, since June of 22. And
a little over a year.
Yeah, what has kind of learning Aquinas and some of these things and philosophers, how has it impacted you?
I think it's... I would say it really has helped me to understand a little bit more about philosophy and get into it more, because before I came here, philosophy wasn't really something I was big into. Like, I was big into current events, following the news, all that stuff, but not really the philosophy of all of it, but by being on the show and talking about it, I've really gotten interested in the Summa, in philosophy, in political philosophy. I still hold that St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the greatest philosophers the world has ever seen. So I'm interested to learn about it every week. And
a lot of the more secular materialist, atheist philosophers really dislike him. Yeah. I think probably in secular colleges and universities, there's probably a great animosity towards him.
Yeah, they typically, it's not even animosity. It was what I've noticed is they kind of just brush over him. They'll include him. They'll go over the entire medievals in a day. And they'll include St. Thomas as one of them and be like, he came up with these 5 proofs, and we've very much debunked those now, but moving on. And that's better than that.
Yeah, but even among Catholics like the Cistercians, for example, we have a Cistercian school and monastery very close to here, and I've talked to some of them. In fact, I had some of them as my teachers when I was taking classes at UD, and I definitely got a sense that they were not, as a whole, really big on Thomism. Is there? I mean, they're based on Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He was the founder of the Cistercians, right? Right. Is there any reason why Clairvaux and Aquinas might have bumped heads? I think Clairvaux lived earlier than Aquinas, maybe a century or two, right? Wasn't he like the thousands or so?
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but the dominant. So when you look at the history of medieval philosophy, Thomism didn't take off until maybe 100 years, maybe a little bit more after Aquinas' death. Obviously, his greatest defender was Albert the Great at the time. But the dominant school, even though in terms of its influence, Thomism had a lot of force, the Franciscan school actually was the dominant school purely because the Franciscans far outnumber the Dominicans in terms of the amount of places they were and number of members of the Franciscan order. And so the Franciscan theology actually was more widely present, even though Thomism was more prestigious in its presentation. So I would guess that the majority of religious orders would have been Thomists. I know for a fact the Carmelites were Thomist, but I don't know about the Cistercians.
And, in the time of Thomas, you had Bonaventure, who was a great Franciscan. Of course, St. Francis of Assisi himself lived shortly before Aquinas. And then you got the guys like Duns Scotus, who was a Franciscan. William of Ockham was a Franciscan. And some problematic stuff coming out in the centuries after Aquinas, which I still, the more I study, I think Occam, man, he really set philosophy in a whole different direction with all this nominalism stuff. So anyways, if you're out there and you want to join the conversation, Dr. Peter Crave
We know you're out there.
We know you're out there. If you want to comment and let us know what's on your mind, or maybe why is Thomism attractive to you,
or why it's not attractive to you.
Why it's not. Yeah. Now, one thing I'm learning as I dig a little bit deeper into Thomism is that, and jump in and either of you and comment on this, is that Aquinas very much is about reason, right? As was Socrates, right? Would you agree? And there's another strand of Christianity that has been much more focused on the will, God's will. And I don't know if you would call it, what is it, voluntarism, or and of course Nietzsche was all about the will, but even among Catholic circles there seems to be and do you know what I'm talking about? Where there's maybe, of course they're both important, the intellect and the will, but when there's an overemphasis on the will, that tends to be problematic. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, not really. I think because, I'm thinking of what St. Thomas, his famous advice to his sister, who was a nun, when asked to write a treatise on how to get to heaven. And he wrote back to her the treatise. And whenever she received it, she was impressed by how quickly he had written back. She opens it up and it's one sentence. He said, "If you want to get to heaven, will it." And that's what
from Aquinas?
That's from Aquinas. But the idea is, what does that mean? Okay, it means that you set your will on your desires. It's kind of the same way that St. Augustine says, love God and do what thou wilt. Because if you are willing to get to heaven, and if you're loving God, then your will be directed towards keeping the commandments. And that's just necessary that it goes together. It goes with the gospel for today. The first greatest commandment, love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And if you do that, then it's necessary that your will is directed towards that, because you can't love if your will doesn't move the affections of charity towards an object, right?
Yeah, I think, now that I think about it, I think it was either Duns Scotus or William of Ockham who taught that God could change his will and will something differently than what he wills now. Like, and this is where it falls into like the moral order that, they would say, for example, well, he did order people in the Old Testament to be killed. And then in the New Testament, we're not supposed to do that. And so it's kind of like a changing will is what, where, and I think Martin Luther,
because that'd be a violation of divine simplicity.
Yeah. I think Martin Luther picked up on this as well, because he was a big fan of Occam. And there seems to be this strand of people that, and there's got to be a name for it, where the whole plan of God is not in place. Like there's some changeability where God can will something 100 years from now that he doesn't will now, whereas I think Aquinas would say that that's not possible.
Yeah, that's classic.
That's the problem.
That's classic Islam. The Muslim belief of God is that he is pure will. And so because of that, that means that he is, whatever he wills, he radically is will. So whatever he can just decide whatever he wants. And so Muslims will say things like, God wills that the heretics remain heretics. God wills that you be enslaved in this way. And we would say that's not true. That's not the case, because God can only will what is good, because God isn't will, he is goodness, truth, beauty. He is being, his being qua being. And that makes it as being simple, it makes his goodness, his truth, and his beauty synonymous with one another. They're the same thing. And so he cannot but will what is good, true, and beautiful. It's why we say in the act of faith, we believe all that the church teaches, because it has been revealed by God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. And I think that's a great distinction between a Catholic understanding of God and a Islamic understanding of God.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. William, any thoughts?
No, I agree with all of that. I think that's very interesting. I didn't think about that before, and how it was like an Islamic belief, but yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's all objective, and yeah, God is truth and goodness and beauty, and that all makes sense.
It's almost like the Muslims, perhaps, if I'm reading this right, can kind of like separate the will from the rest of God, whereas, like you say with Aquinas, it's all the same. His essence, his being, his intellect, his will, his everything, it's all the same. His existence, it's just one thing. And that's hard to get our heads around, because it is pretty complicated for us, And that was like the Richard Dawkins the quote that we were playing. I don't know if you listened to Catholic Drive Time this morning, but
it was
never. What's Catholic Drive Time? There's a quote where this, very bright, I don't. I guess that's a good question. Can you be a bright atheist? I don't know.
Yeah,
because you missed the most.
Can you be a wise fool?
Yeah, the
fool says in heart there is no God, right?
You're right. The most fundamental question that you should get right. If you get it wrong, because a lot of people will say, that Christopher Hitchens, he was a really, really bright guy. But can you be bright and be an atheist? I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, so Dawkins, in the soundbite that Adrian was playing this morning, was saying that God can't be simple, because he basically has to do so many things. He has to answer so many prayers. He has to run a world. He's got to, he just couldn't get his head around the fact that God's simplicity would be inconsistent with, in his mind, all the stuff that God has to do. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
But anybody commenting?
Yes. Monica says, hello, just joining. What did I miss? Nothing yet. We're just kind of all over the place. Let's see. Annabelle
the first
said
17 minutes. That's what you missed.
Annabelle says, God wills our good, and he wants us to surrender his good and perfect will to his good and perfect will. Amen, Annabelle. So true. I think the big aspect of this is that we recognize, I don't know, I talk about this on the radio occasionally, and I think I brought it up this week. One of the prayers that I make is that I desire God's will, because sometimes I I know that I want God's will, but sometimes I want my own will. Like I'm thinking about something and I'm like, I really just want to do what I want to do, but I want God's will. And that's very difficult. And because we recognize, I'm thinking about Our Lady, like, let not I act, but Our Lady acts within me. Let not myself love Jesus, but let Our Lady love Jesus within me. Let me be transubstantiated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, as Max Kolbe would say. It's something that is very much, it's difficult. It's easier said than done. It's kind of like when Thomas Aquinas' advice, if you want to get to heaven, will it? Easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One of the things that, the section of the Summa about grace is really interesting because he asks questions like, can a sinner be reconciled to God without grace? That's pretty obvious. No, it's not possible. And then, can you know any truth without grace? And that one is really interesting because we have a natural capacity to know truth, but without like an initial grace, we wouldn't even be able to know anything. And then he asks a question like, can man prepare himself for grace without grace? And even then, Thomas is like, no, you can't. So it's like God always takes a first step, right?
Yeah.
And which almost seems like, okay, I can't even do anything. So if I say, God, please, give me the grace to be holier, then you'd have to assume, well, the very fact that I said that was because God gave me the grace to do it, right? And it's kind of strange because how does that jive with free will? Because if I couldn't do that without God making the first move, in what way was that free?
Right.
So answer that, smarty pants.
Yeah, I always say in my prayers, thank you, God, for all the good that I've done. Thank you, God, for all the good that I've received. And I'm sorry, God, for all the bad that I've done and all the bad that I've received, because I know the good is from God and the bad is from me. And I think that's something important that we recognize because we would like to, in our own human nature, blame God. And we'd like to blame God for our woes, when in reality, God is good. And anything that is bad in the sense of sinful is obviously has to be from us. Now, obviously, God can send us sufferings as testing and things like that. But in terms of things that we do that is immoral, that's us. Anything that we do that's good, it's only from God.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. God, as I was learning in my in a Thomistic psychology class I'm taking at our local co-op, I was in yesterday. The teacher said that God is all good, and the definition of evil is anything apart from God, or sorrow, or anything like that is anything that's taken away from the good. It's anything that's not good. So therefore,
like a privation of good, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Which is the whole thing of God identifying himself as I am, which means that God's essence and his existence are the same thing. So he's like perfect being. And I think that the Thomistic, and I think Augustine also touched on this as well, where the evil is just a privation of being. It's like doesn't have any being at all. It's just like
God never created it.
Right, because then you'd have to say God created something bad, but it's just it's kind of hard to get your head around because it's a but it seems like a real thing. I mean,
it makes sense. Like you think of like darkness. Well, I guess what is this? See, darkness is it all light or is it no light? I forget.
Yeah.
Like it takes in all the light and then there's
becomes
darkness.
Dark.
Yeah. And you think of a hole, you dig a hole and it's removing all the things. A hole is not actually a thing. It's an absence of the dirt.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good analogy. Yeah.
And so we think about the moral life. It's like a evil, a viciousness is not, you're not gaining it, you're losing virtue. And the more virtue you lose, the less human you become. So Our Lady was the most human because she had all virtue.
Right.
So let me read a paragraph from this article here. It's called "Why Do We Study St. Thomas Aquinas?" He says, I don't even know who the author is, to be honest with you. But it's all good.
Me.
It's all good. You did it. Okay.
I'll take credit.
One of the main tasks in the evangelization of culture is to conform the mind of man to the mind of God. All right, which is interesting because it didn't say, and again, I'm not trying to pose mind and will against each other, but it says the mind of man to the mind of God. This entails that we should have the mind of God. We should have the mind of the church. Thus, the main goal of our intellectual formation is to conform ourselves to the mind of the church. This necessarily requires that we should arrive at the certainty of truth founded on the objective reality of things. All right, so that's pretty good stuff. Benedict XVI describes our world today as a collapse of civilization that seeks for the truth, due primarily to the self-limitation of reason, in which the ephemeral is affirmed as a value and the possibility of discovering the real meaning of life is cast into doubt. Relativism has become the central problem for faith in our time, for we are in a cultural situation that exalts subjectivism as a criteria and measure of truth. Okay, that's pretty good stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it's so true for society today.
There's so many people that when Benedict was alive, I never read much of Pope Benedict XVI. Many people said he was like maybe one of the greatest theologian popes we've ever had. Did you get into reading Pope Benedict XVI much?
I read quite a bit of Pope Benedict, but one thing about Benedict is the change in Benedict over time. I think that's interesting because before he became Pope, it was very clear that he didn't want to be Pope. He wanted to be a theologian. And you kind of see early on, he was a part of the Nouveau Theologie crew, which was very bad. Gary Goulagrange,
Balthazar,
von Balthazar is one of the major players in Nouveau Theologie. Gary Goulagrange wrote an amazing I guess it's a book called "Where is the New Theology Leading Us?" And it's actually been recently republished by a professor at the University of St. Thomas, translated. But what I'm trying to get at is, whenever he became Pope, Benedict realized that he had to put aside the new theology and have a return to Thomism. And he even articulates that, I had to go find a source for remember where specifically he said this, where he basically said something along the lines of, we got bored with Thomism. So it wasn't that they realized that Thomism was wrong or was not suited anymore. It's that because Thomism is very simple. I mean, there's parts of it that are complicated, but in general, it's pretty straightforward. It's all very reasonable. It's very clear. And for people who study it the way they do in the scholastics in the schools, you study it systematically, and it's been commented on by all the great commentators for 800 years. And so they were bored, and they wanted to do new things. And so they create this Nouveau Theologie. So I think it's interesting to see Benedict and his, once he became Pope, realizing, or actually really when he became Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, he realized, I need to return to Thomism, and I need to return to what is sure, what is stable, and I can't play theologian anymore.
Mm-hmm. I've always thought of him as being Augustinian. Isn't that how he identified himself? And what would you think that means if somebody is more Augustinian than Thomist?
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine, Father Martin, who is a Augustinian priest, and he would tell me, he says, this whole distinction between saying that you're an Augustinian or a Thomist is silly because Aquinas was an Augustinian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
And so it kind of makes the point that there's really, the distinction is more of a distinction of Aquinas, post-Aquinas is basically taking Augustine and keep moving forward. People who try to go to Augustine and then stick and stay in Augustine is kind of climbing down the shoulders of giants.
Mm-hmm. But Augustine was much more Platonic, and
right.
They don't even know if he had access to Aristotle, when he lived. And then, of course, Aquinas comes along who had access to both Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle was not, the church didn't want the theologians to really be studying Aristotle, but Aquinas still did. But it's interesting. You sometimes wonder how would it have changed Augustine if he had access to Aristotle?
Yeah.
What difference would that have made? But he definitely latched on to Aristotle. Martin Luther was an Augustinian priest, and I don't know if that means anything. You said you have a friend who's an Augustinian priest, but I don't know any Augustinian priests. Is it an order that is worldwide, or is it still a thing?
So Augustinians are not like Dominicans, where Dominicans have a single master general, and that's kind of what they're in charge. Augustinians traditionally were associated with canons, and so they were attached to a cathedral or a church, and they grew up around them. In later times, Augustinians tended to become other orders were Augustinian in the sense they followed the rule of St. Augustine, and the Augustinian order kind of died out a lot. There's been kind of thinned. It was very much thinned out. They still exist today throughout the world, but there's not a one central authority that is like, this is the Master General of the Augustinian order. It's more similar to that of the Franciscans, where there's like a billion different kinds of subsets of Franciscan, the CFRs, the OFRs, the Franciscans, the Immaculate, all these other ones. They have tons of them. Same kind of idea with the Augustinians. They're kind of independent, autonomous kind of things.
The interesting thing about Augustine, I find, is, Augustine would, I guess, officially be in the early Middle Ages. So you had Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in 300-400 BC, and then you have the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Sophists around the time of Socrates, and then you have the beginning of Christianity. And Augustine comes about 400 or so, and then maybe 100 or so years later, Boethius, and then for a long time you don't really have anybody, do you? I mean, you have Augustine, Boethius. I mean, who were the philosophers between Boethius and, say...
You have Peter Lombard?
Lombard, but he was just like a century before Aquinas, right? Mm-hmm. And you had, Abelard, mm-hmm. I guess, before Aquinas. And you also had Anselm, mm-hmm. and who would have been like maybe...
300 years?
Yeah, not too long. But there was a big, long, I bet you there's like a 500-600 year period where, is that why they call it the Dark Ages? I mean, they're like, who or were they just
there's
like, man, we're content with Aristotelian philosophy, or did it go dark? Or I find that period approximately maybe like 600 to 1,000.
Yeah, I think
who are the philosophers?
I think the main problem is that Aquinas is such a shining light of that time period that he overshadowed basically everyone else in the surrounding time, including his fellow Dominicans. Because, for instance, Albert the Great only became known; he was only canonized 100 years ago.
Is that right?
And, yeah, he was very unknown, and yet. He was a professor of Aquinas. He was studying Aristotle before Aquinas, and all these different things, different fields as well, many fields. And so, off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody, but I could almost guarantee that there are a ton of philosophers that we just don't know, that kind of just been lost to history because Aquinas just overshadows them. Mm-hmm. And that kind of happens. Post, like if you go through, can you name me the top 5 Dominican theologians from post Aquinas to like 500 years later? Mm-hmm. Like, could you name 5?
Yeah, right. Well, because it was just all Aquinas, right? They're all relying on Aquinas, and interesting. So, all right. Well, this is Back to the Father, and I have a doozy of some trivia questions that we're going to ask in about 20 minutes as we close out the show. I'm going to pit William against Adrian, okay? And William's younger than Adrian by about 7 years.
20. Oh, sorry.
No, not 20 years. And so I'm going to ask him the easier questions and Adrian the more challenging questions, but it should be a lot of fun. If you want to comment about anything that we're talking about, it's just kind of a round table, scatter shooting kind of conversation. I like this kind of stuff, just kind of to talking stuff. And feel free to jump in, William. I know Adrian and I both like to talk about a lot, especially myself. But you got any thoughts?
So far, not really anything that you guys haven't already said.
Okay.
I think the whole history of philosophy thing is very interesting. You have Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, those big ones, and then the Sophists, all of those, and then you hit Aquinas, and then even centuries later you hit John Locke, and you hit William of Ockham and
Descartes,
and all of those, Blaise Pascal, and all of those other other philosophers, Nietzsche. I think the whole history of philosophy thing is very interesting, and to really compare the modern ones to the ancient or the medieval ones, and to really see, the modern ones have really had an impact on society today. The society is kind of following more of their philosophy, not so much the philosophy of what you would have heard in the Middle Ages or in the ancient period. I think that the way it's all played out is very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of it's been lost. Let me just read this paragraph real quickly. It's talking about the attributes of Aquinas and what makes him somebody that we really should take seriously and study. And it says, realism and objectivity. Realism is the main feature of Thomistic thought. Its prevailing characteristic is that it is always in search of truth. It is faithful to the voice of created things, which builds the edifice of philosophy, and faithful to the voice of the church to construct the building of theology. Thomism is, so to speak, a sort of natural gospel, an incomparably firm foundation for all constructions of scientific inquiry, because Thomism is characterized primarily by their objectivity. Theirs are not buildings or lifts purely abstract spirit, but buildings that follow the real momentum of things, never decay the value of Thomistic doctrine, because to do so would have to decline the value of things. Okay, I know that's kind of worried. That actually was a couple of quotes from popes. But realism is something that is really interesting. And I have a hard time because I teach high school kids talking about realism and universalism versus nominalism. And I think, if you look at the bad philosophers of the last, 600-700 years, they almost all are nominalists. If you look at the good philosophers, they're realists. Would you say that there's a demarcation?
Yes, for sure. Because I think the main thing, especially when trying to explain realism to high schoolers, I would say, realists is basically the position that we can generally trust our senses.
Yeah,
and that's simple as. Whereas the nominalist position is basically we cannot generally trust our senses, and the universalist would pretty much agree with the realist. They're very similar to the realist. They just think that we trust our senses, but it's actually directing us towards something that's beyond the physical world.
Yeah.
So St. Thomas Aquinas, recognizing as a realist, seeing that you can actually perceive things and then draw knowledge from what we perceive. It's very much the opposite of the way angels work. Angels take in knowledge immediately. We deduce knowledge. So they think discursively where we think deductively.
But angels would have to be realists, because otherwise there's nothing there.
Of course.
Because an angel, they can't be nominalists because they wouldn't have anything to place a name on, because they can't see anything.
Right.
So they only see reality, but see intellectually, right?
Right. And
I never thought about that.
And it's important because we can't reason if we can't trust that things in front of us are what they are. Because how could you deduce, for instance, if I say, if I look out the window and I see a green car with bumper stickers in the back driving up to the studio, and I look over, I can now deduce, Sissel's coming in. Because, that's a green car, there's bumper stickers, it seems to have the GRN stickers, let me deduce that. But if you're a nominalist, you can actually make that leap, because who knows what that is? It could be anything.
But it all seems, like when I try to explain it, it all seems like, who cares? Well, it all seems kind of like nonsense. But I know what you're trying to say, Adrian, is it actually does matter. Have you learned anything about that? Realism and nominalism?
I think a lot of what Adrian said really ties into what I'm learning about in rationalism and empiricism. This idea that the rationalists will say, well, I can know that this thing, like, for example, I can know gluttony's wrong. I don't need to experience gluttony or experience someone eating too much to know it's wrong. I can just use my mind to know that. But the empiricist view is more of, well, I have to see it to know it. I think there's definitely a truth to both. In rationalism and empiricism, as far as I know, is a rather modern idea of how we get knowledge in epistemology. But it is definitely something very interesting.
Yeah, it sure is.
one real quick. Rebecca says howdy from Midland. Good morning, howdy to you, Rebecca.
Hey,
Amanda
Rebecca.
says good afternoon. Good afternoon, Amanda. So it's interesting you brought that up because have you ever heard this? Because okay, we're talking about, let's bring this into practical, right? People are saying, oh, why does this matter? Who cares? Have you ever heard this phrase? No uterus, no opinion. No uterus, no opinion. They're talking about,
men have no opinion.
So-
We're not going to listen to you if you don't.
exactly. So you're a man, you can't give an opinion about abortion because you don't have a uterus. So why does that follow? Explain to me, why do I need a uterus in order to have an opinion about abortion? It doesn't follow. But if you're falling into these bad philosophies, you might say, oh, well, yeah, the only knowledge you can have has to be experiential. And so it goes in so far that when it goes to this, they talk about God. Oh, God must have experienced evil. He must do evil because that's the only way that evil can exist, because he knows it. Now, we can know it intellectually without knowing it experientially, is the point. The same way you would say a surgeon doesn't need to have gone through those surgeries in order to do surgery on you. These intellectual knowledge, it is not necessarily tied with the experiential knowledge. And I think that's something that has to be kept in mind. One other point, kind of going backwards, of something you had mentioned earlier about the Cistercians. I couldn't find Cistercians, but Leo XIII in Aeterni Patris says, quote, "It is known that nearly all the founders and lawgivers of the religious orders commanded their members to study and religiously adhere to the teachings of St. Thomas, fearful lest any of them should swerve even in the slightest degree from the footsteps of so great a man. The statutes of the Benedictines, the Carmelites, the Augustinians, the Society of Jesus, and many others all testify that they are bound by this law," end quote.
He didn't mention the Cistercians.
He didn't mention the Cistercians, but
Yeah.
he did mention the Augustinians.
Interesting. Yeah. So that I've always thought the pitting of Augustine against Aquinas, for the reasons you explained, is that you're not going to read the Summa for more than about a page without getting a quote from Augustine. And Thomas is very reverential towards Augustine, and a couple of times he disagrees with him, but you can tell he hates to do that.
Yeah, I think he does. He does the same thing with Aristotle. I mean, he calls him the philosopher in the Summa. It's similar.
Yeah, sure does. All right, pretty interesting stuff. I'm just, spend most of my time just digging into this stuff, and I think, I don't know, we ought to have more of these conversations.
Yeah.
I think there's not enough conversations about just what does it mean to be a human person, especially in light of our relationship with God, our relationship with other creatures, the angels. What's the difference between, angels and man, and
I think
that kind of stuff.
I think philosophy is a really, really interesting subject now that I've gotten into it, because the people who aren't into philosophy as much or don't really think about it at all, you can't, in my opinion, you can't really think too deeply about where we've come to as a society if you don't really know the background of how we got here. I mean, philosophy has a huge impact on society. The modern, like I said, the modern philosophers are in a certain way controlling society by what they wrote and by what they taught in their philosophy. So I think really knowing how we got here today and who did all this is really, it's something really interesting to think about. And I just find myself thinking about it all the time, just in my free time, just really dwelling on it.
Yeah, I wish I was, when I was his age, actually having a conversation like this. I would have been nowhere. I've told you that many times.
Yeah.
What y'all both just said there reminds me of why I dislike the field of psychology. I dislike the field of psychology because psychology literally should be the study of the soul, the psyche, the soul. But it's not, because most of psychology is based off false philosophies. And if you teach them false philosophies, there's no wonder that people are all lost. And these psychologists are trying to, they have a worldview, they have their own anthropology, a Freudian anthropology, really. And then they try to say, okay, I'm going to fix you. But their idea of fixing you is conforming you to a Freudian man. And this is the same thing that we would say, like, if you're an engineer. If you're a bad engineer and your idea of a building is one that's not structurally sound, and you're like, oh, I'm going to construct this building, I'm going to fix this building, but your ideal for a building is an unstable building. Well, whenever you try to direct it towards that, what's going to happen? It's going to collapse. And the same thing is true of doctors. If a doctor says, oh, a properly set foot is one that's crooked 70 degrees off. Well, then when he tries to set your foot that's broken, you're going to have more problems. So man he has issues and he's trying to seek help and he goes to a psychologist. Psychologist has a false anthropology. And so when he's trying to fix you and trying to set your mind right onto proper anthropologies, what's happening? They're breaking you and sending you further down the wrong road. And so philosophy is very important. Anthropology is very important. It's literally life or death. People commit suicide on outrageous rates. And it's mostly to do with having a false anthropology and a false idea of the world and false ends, not knowing who we are and where we're going.
Yeah, interesting. Have you done my study on Carl Jung, the archetypes and all that?
A little bit.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Mostly the Wolfenstein's lectures.
Yeah, it's there's so much to learn. Phenomenology. I'm not a big fan.
No.
John Paul II considered himself a phenomenologist,
He did.
right?
Yeah.
Edmund Husserl was I think they call him kind of the founder of phenomenology. And interestingly, his student was Martin Heidegger. Husserl was a Jew, and he was a teacher of a university in Germany at the time that World War II broke out. Well, Martin Heidegger ended up, I think, taking his position. Husserl got fired because he was a Jew, and then Heidegger became a Nazi. And now Heidegger, obviously has some faults, fell into Nazism. Now, I don't think he ever apologized throughout his life, but he wrote some interesting works on being and just existence. And I actually would like to read some Heidegger. There's like a whole lot of stuff I want to read,
I think Thomistic phenomenology is a contradiction in terms.
Oh, is that right? Why
I
so?
think so.
Why so?
I think because realism and phenomenology don't go together. I think phenomenologists, they take what they see, and instead of conforming the mind to reality, but then also conforming the reality to the faith, they say, okay, whatever I see must be what it is. And so now you err too far in the opposite direction. Because like I said, the realist tradition says that your senses are generally reliable, not always reliable. And so if I say, oh, hey, Dave, your shirt is pink, and I actually see a pink shirt, well, my eyes are messed up. I'm colorblind. Something's wrong with me. And I need to conform my perception to reality, even though I may be wrong. Or phenomenologists would say, well, that is your perception, therefore it is what that is. And it goes regards for that for the faith as well. And so I think that Thomistic phenomenology is a contradiction in terms because it violates realism.
Interesting. I know Peter Kraft, and this is going a little bit off that topic. Peter Kraft says that what needs to be combined is Thomism and personalism.
Interesting.
And I don't know if you know exactly what he means by that. What I think he means, the Thomism, if you read the Summa, it's kind of it's a system, right? It's a way, that's the way I see it anyway. This is a way to come to know God and how to live a virtuous life and direct all things to our final end. But I think what he means by that is inserting the individual person into that matrix or that framework, I guess you can say. But it's interesting. He said that a couple of times. What do you think of when you think of personalism? What is that a brand of philosophy, or what would you say that is?
I don't know. What do you mean when you say personalism?
Yeah, that's why I think personalism, it probably would be related to existentialism. It's seeing things through and I think phenomenology might have some overlap as well, but seeing things from the perspective of the individual person. Because
it's opposite of wisdom.
Aquinas doesn't say in the Summa, well, what you need to do is you need to live a virtuous life. You need to, do this. He's not. It's not a manual of how a person should live. Right. He's laying it out there as a framework and just saying, this is what God is. This is the Trinity. It's very, it's. I don't know.
If by personalism you mean a position that basically is a progenitor of phenomenology, then I would say that personalism cannot be reconciled with Thomism because it's the opposite of wisdom. Because wisdom is to see things from God's perspective. It's one way to put it. That's very simply put. To see things through God's perspective. Another way to put it is to see through a Catholic lens. And by a Catholic lens, I mean a universal lens, to see everything according to the whole.
But an individual person has to have wisdom.
Right.
You know, you and I and William are not like, I guess, sharing a wisdom is that it's my objective to become wise, and it's your objective to become wise, and William's, right? And so in that regard, yes, you know, wisdom is important, but I need to personally become wise.
Well, but that's not what personalism is, though.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because personalism isn't that you personally need to learn something. It's more seeing the world through the human lens. And it doesn't really regard, it's not so subjective that it's like the individual person. So it's like, it's not you and me and then Dave. It's humans, it's persons in general. Okay, how does the human person perceive things beyond itself? And how does it relate to the human person? But we want to see things objectively, not in relation to us.
But somebody like Soren Kierkegaard, you know, his gravestone, I hope I get this right, said something like that this guy, you know, that's what it's something like that. I may have gotten that a little bit wrong, but what he's, you know, when you talk about somebody like Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche was this way because they're both existentialists. We're talking about, you know, Kierkegaard especially, is that his experience, his personal experience, not crowd thinking, not doing this, you know, religious thing because everybody else is doing. And again, I'm not endorsing this because I think we have to live within a framework of a religion. But I think there's a lot between existentialism and personalism. I think, and again, I may be wrong, but I'm just kind of digging into this a little bit more, is inserting the person into the framework of Thomistic philosophy.
I think
individually.
You're in the tradition of Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain seemed to try to reconcile personalism and Thomism. I've recently, after reading through, are you familiar with what's his name? The guy who's one of the co-founders of Clear Creek Abbey, one of the intellectual founders.
Okay.
Not John Green. Gee whiz.
Thomist?
Yes, he's wrote Death of Christian Culture and Restoration of Christian Culture, and they're famous books that he was. John Senior. John Senior is his name. So the famous John Senior, yeah, he was one of the people of the intellectual tradition of founding the Benedictine monastery, Clear Creek Abbey. And in his Death of Christian Culture, he has a scathing critique of Jacques Maritain. And I was quite surprised by that because University of St. Thomas is very much a Maritainian school. That's the kind of the brand of Thomism that's the most popular at St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas in Houston. I was speaking to Dr. Rebard about it because I was kind of surprised. I was like, I didn't realize John Senior was so anti Jacques Maritain. And he kind of made the comment to me. He was like, yeah, the kind of rethinking Jacques Maritain kind of was trying to reconcile Thomism to the modern world. And so he gets a lot of things that are right, but he also starts to allow for some modern ideas to creep into Thomism, which was most prevalent in his ideas of like his work on beauty, which is very, very popular, which is what Bishop Barron actually subscribes to. That's where he gets a lot of his ideas of beauty.
And he considers himself a Thomist. Yeah,
correct.
Bishop
Right.
Barron. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I don't know. It's a topic to jump
Meister
into.
Eckhart is also another one. Very mystical Thomism, but anyways, interesting. So, all right, we're about to go into our trivia.
Uh-oh.
And do you have any comments before we close out, William?
Yeah, not like a big one, but I think one of the things I'd close out with is going back to the philosophers. I like
Back to the Father?
Back to the philosopher.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting is the idea that the modern philosophers, as we were saying earlier in the show, kind of tend to go off to, down the path of, is this really real? Is this thing I'm looking at really there? Like the nominalists.
Yeah.
I think it's the kind of philosophy to where I think we've gotten, like the kind of philosophy we have today, that this idea of transgenderism, that a guy can be a woman because I can look at you, but I can't really know for sure what you are. It's kind of like that idea, but you're shifting away from the modern and the ancient, who say, there is a God, and there is an order, and there is objective reality.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you for that comment. You guys ready? I'm going to ask Adrian a question, the more challenging ones, and I'm going to ask William. These are about stories of particular saints.
If anyone's listening that is willing to come and help me out, I'm phoning a friend early. Throw those comments in quick.
Do we have? I know this is kind of a deep conversation. Do we have some people that are still with us, or are we?
No new comments. I'm looking. Let me check over. One person watching on Facebook. 5 watching on YouTube, and 1 watching on your Back to the Father channel.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Well, to the 7 of you, thank you so much for being here. We're glad you're here. All right. So I'll start with William. This one, okay. This saint once challenged a Muslim sultan to a trial by fire.
Based.
Okay. You know this one, right?
You're asking me?
Okay. No.
Oh.
This is William. Okay. The saint was known for his great devotion to poverty and his love of nature, but he was also a great defender of the faith. He gained an audience with the Sultan Al-Kamil during the time of the Fifth Crusade, and attempted to convince him that Christianity was superior to Islam. Toward the end of their debate, this person challenged the Sultan to a trial in which each of them would step into a fire, and the one with the true religion would be spared by God. You know this?
I do.
Okay, so
I feel like I should
you got
know
15
this.
seconds on the clock, or else Adrian can steal.
Do 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 do.
Oh man, was it a Pope Leo?
You're close.
Okay, who do you
Not
think?
really.
Who do you think it is?
It's St. Francis of Assisi.
Yes, Saint Francis of Assisi. Okay, so Adrian's particularly good at this kind of stuff, so don't feel bad if you don't get it. Okay.
Well, I've been
now here's an
doing
interesting one.
saints of the
This will
days
be
for a long
This
time.
will be for Adrian. You can,
Oh,
you can
no.
steal as well if he doesn't know it. Okay?
Oh no.
Now this
Oh,
one,
no.
this one I never knew before. Okay,
Okay.
this saint once made fun of a woman's feet.
Oh, Padre Pio.
No,
No? Oh, St. Thomas Aquinas.
should I give it to him?
Yes.
So, like, you got a lot of famous
Yes.
saints that are making fun of women's feet, or what?
It was St. Thomas Aquinas. The woman was levitating.
There was,
He saw her
there
feet.
was a nun
Yeah.
in a nearby convent who was developing a reputation for holiness. Many of Thomas's brothers were quite taken with her. One day, Thomas and some of the brothers went to see the nun and found her in the midst of mystical prayer, levitating high above the ground. The others were deeply in awe, but Thomas just looked at her and said, "You have ugly feet." The woman stopped praying, came back down to the ground, and began yelling at Thomas for insulting her. Thomas then said that she could not be truly holy if she were so self-involved.
Yep.
That's a true story.
That's a true story.
Wow.
I've never heard that.
Yep. Yeah, and
You have ugly feet.
It's great. It's very similar to a story of Saint Vincent Ferrer that maybe if we have time I'll share. Lee
Okay.
Owens had got it. She said it was Aquinas, so very good to
Okay.
Lee. And Annabelle said Saint Francis for the first one, so she got that one.
So she got that.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now we go on back to William. This saint is the patron saint of television writers. It's hard to imagine this great ascetic saint who founded the Order of the Poor something, chilling out on the couch and laughing uproariously at a sitcom. Nevertheless, in 1958, Pope Pius XII named her the patron saint of television writers. When she was too ill to attend Mass, she reportedly had the vision of a Mass that she could hear on the wall of her room. This patronage of television would later be adopted by Mother Angelica, herself a poor, when she started what became EWTN, which today makes it possible for many people. You know this one, right?
I think I do.
Yeah.
I think I
Was
do.
this 20th century?
I thought we talked about this with Sissel on the show before.
Did we?
I thought so. Yeah.
we did, I
maybe
don't
I'm wrong.
remember.
I can't believe the Mother Angelica's order. You don't know Mother
Oh
Angelica?
yeah, of course.
Well, okay, go
the
ahead.
Port Clairs.
Okay, yeah,
St. Clair. St. Clair of Assisi. Yeah.
Okay, so St. Clair. Let's see. Okay, this is going to be a tough one for Adrian. This Pope became.
Gunslinger got it. He said St. Clair.
Oh, got it. Okay, good. This Pope became Pope while he was on vacation. He was a nobleman and a Christian, but he was not involved in ministry or any particular church work. He went to Rome along with many others in AD 236.
Yes.
When Pope Anterus died, he hoped to see the great sights of that venerable city and to be a part of the crowd when the new Pope was elected. As the election was about to take place, a dove flew into the crowd and landed on his head in clear imitation of the descent of the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove upon the Savior. According to the 3rd century historian Eusebius, the people immediately started to gather around this person shouting, "Worthy!" This person was then obliged to be ordained a deacon, then a priest, and then a bishop so that he could become Pope. This, of course, finally gave him the opportunity to wear his "I went to Rome and all I got was to be elected Supreme Pontiff" t-shirt. Okay. That's crazy, isn't it?
That is
man,
amazing.
I literally did this saint of the day not that long ago.
Okay, let's go to the audience out there. Is anybody
Let's
getting
see
it?
if anybody know it. Does
Okay.
anybody know it?
And I'll tell you, if anybody gets this, you have stumped Adrian Fonseca. Okay, that
who
means
is
that
it?
means a lot. And it's a name that you've heard.
I think I have a guess.
Okay, come on, Annabelle. If you're
Annabelle
still
says
out there,
Paul VI. No, that's not Paul
Okay,
VI.
Paul the
That's
Sixth, no.
way
No, you're-
earlier than that.
You're off by about 1,500 years,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, Paul VI was 1960s.
Was it?
Okay, 15 seconds on the clock.
Was it?
Come on, man, William, steal
Gregory
it.
the Second?
No, Saint Fabian.
Saint Fabian.
Okay.
Darn.
All right, good.
Darn
I
it.
finally stumped Adrian.
I
All
did
right,
this saint of the day not that long ago. I remember. I
Okay,
just can't remember his name.
William, this is an easier one.
Uh-oh.
His name is practically synonymous with Ireland. Every year, millions of people in America.
Just jump in,
Yeah,
dude.
St.
Yet
Patrick.
he was not actually Irish from birth. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So William is on the board.
The part of that question, okay, what was he? He wasn't Irish. What was he?
English?
British.
Yeah,
British,
British.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. Okay, so there are 4 churches in Adrian. There are 4 churches in Wales named after Saint something. Almost nothing is known about this early church saint, but the existence of 4 churches named after him in the Diocese of St. David's in Wales testifies to his existence. He also apparently founded a monastery. You're probably not going to get this.
Humbert.
No. Law Dog.
Oh, there's no way. I never,
There's 4
ever would have
churches
got
named
that.
after him, okay?
I know. I grew up at that church in England.
Okay, so let me see. A couple more here. Let's see.
This guy.
Okay, I'll go ahead and just leave this one wide open to either of you, okay? This saint had 24 siblings.
24 siblings. Teresa of Avila.
No.
Oh.
Not all of her siblings lived to adulthood, but she was one of 25. She had a twin. She may be the great saint in the family, but her mother clearly deserves a medal. And she was a lay Dominican.
Oh, Catherine of Siena.
Yeah.
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 Okay,
And,
Catherine of Siena. And then let's see. One real hard one and then one easy one. And then we'll be done, okay? This saint, a popular saint among the Greek Orthodox. Does he count if it's a Greek Orthodox?
Well, popular among them,
He was a Ukrainian captured as a prisoner of war and sold to a
What year?
Turkish Muslim. He eventually earned the deep respect of his master by his great humility and unwavering faith. One night when his master was away on pilgrimage, he made pilaf for the family of his master. His master's wife mentioned that it was the master's favorite dish. Okay, St. John the Russian.
What year is this?
I have no idea.
That can't be a real
It doesn't
saint.
say. Okay,
Fake saint.
here's the last one.
Not a real saint.
Okay, so this is for all the marbles. Okay, whoever gets this one, including the all of our friends out there on social media. Okay, just say it if you know it. Okay, as a young man,
Lawrence.
No,
Oh.
as a young man and a new convert, he was riding across Spain when he met a Muslim who argued with him about his religion. As the Muslim rode away, he said something over his shoulder that was insulting about the Virgin
St.
Mary.
Ignatius of Loyola.
Dang.
Yeah.
I remember reading back when I was younger, way
Okay.
younger. I remember reading a comment about
Ignatius
it.
was so
Impressive.
angry that he wanted to kill him, but he decided he would let the donkey he was riding determine if it was the right thing to do. If the donkey followed the man, Ignatius would kill him, but if he would not, fortunately for the Muslim and for a lot of people who love Ignatian spirituality, the donkey took a different path. So Ignatius
I don't know. It make me like Ignatian spirituality a little bit more.
That's, oh man, he was, yeah.
That's so Spanish of him.
Yeah, yeah. So there you go.
That's awesome.
Man, he shoots, he scores.
There
it
you
actually
go.
was kind of like a tie because I don't know, but
Yeah.
but
Because there were some neither of us got,
that,
right?
that was yeah, there were some, but all right, very
Well,
good.
there you go, folks. I thought this segment was people asking you trivia.
Oh no. It was that way a while back, but we got away from that, right?
Right.
Of late, it was me. It's me asking William and Sissel. It
That's
always
hilarious.
seems to kind of come down to the wire almost
Almost
every
every time, yeah.
every single time. Okay,
Well, there you go, folks.
all right.
So is that it? Do
Yeah,
I
that-
play the outro?
That's it. You
All
get
right.
to you get to go home now.
All right, playing the outro. There you go.
Thanks everybody for watching. This has been Back to the Father. God bless you. Good job, man. So you've heard that story.
Thanks for joining us for Back to the Father. And don't forget, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. If you have comments about the show, email Dave Palmer at grnonline.com.